Tonight, I'll be explaining the complete Resident Evil 7 story from beginning to end. Before we even get to Ethan arriving at the Baker house, I'm going to be covering the full backstory behind the outbreak, including Ethan and Mia's lives before the game, the connections, Eveline, how the Baker family got infected, the 3 years leading up to Resident Evil 7, Lucas Baker's involvement, and what the BSAA and Blue Umbrella already knew before the incident. This is going to be a calm video for sleep, so just relax and listen along. Ethan Winters existed as an ordinary civilian within the municipal landscape of Los Angeles. He functioned as a systems engineer, a technical role that required high intellect but offered zero exposure to the global biological weapons trade. He possessed no formal military training and no survival background, making him a statistical anomaly in the history of the prehistoric fire. Ethan was a man of routine and logic, entirely disconnected from the shadow wars of the 21st century. In 2014, his life reached a terminal point of stagnation when his wife, Mia, vanished during a routine assignment. Ethan believed she worked for an international trading company, a cover story that he accepted without professional suspicion. He spent 3 years in a state of localized grief, assuming his partner had deceased in an industrial accident. He had no awareness that his entire domestic life was a carefully maintained facade. The 3-year silence was a documented period of psychological decay for the engineer. He maintained a solitary existence, unaware that federal agencies and the BSAA were monitoring the fallout of Mia's final mission. Ethan lived in a world of digital shadows, waiting for a signal that would never come from the woman he knew. He was a survivor of a private tragedy, unaware that a larger biological horror was waiting in the bayou. The civilian status of the protagonist is a unique lore beat in the franchise. Unlike the specialized Reapers of the Stars or the DSO, Ethan moved into the fire with only his human willpower. He was the raw material for a corporate experiment that he did not understand. His background provided a perfect contrast for the extraordinary rot he would encounter in the Louisiana swamp. The systems engineer was about to face a mechanical failure of the species. Part 2, Mia Winters and the Connections. The Operative Mask. Mia Winters functioned as a high-level covert operative for a shadowy international crime syndicate known as the Connections. This organization specialized in biochemical warfare and the management of experimental biological assets. Mia utilized her trading company job as a primary industrial shroud to mask her role as a professional handler. She was a woman of absolute professional deception who successfully compartmentalized her domestic life from her corporate duties. Her final assignment in October 2014 involved the high-stakes transport of the syndicate's crowning achievement. She was tasked with moving the asset across the Pacific Ocean under the guise of an executive guardian. The objective was to keep the biological payload hidden from both rival corporate spies and global authorities, like the BSAA. Mia operated with a mechanical focus, her mind already calculating the logistics of the transit. She was a professional, moving a god through a storm. The Connections viewed Mia as an essential component of the E-Series project. She possessed the tactical training to manage a volatile biological entity while maintaining a low-profile presence in the civilian sector. Her career was a documented record of industrial espionage and viral containment. Mia moved through the boardrooms and the shipping docks with a fake name and a cold resolve. She was the architect of the domestic lie that Ethan called home. The industrial reality of her job involved the constant risk of biological contamination. Mia understood the lethal nature of the prehistoric fire and the instability of the asset she guarded. She was an auditor of the apocalypse who was prepared to liquidate any witness to the corporate mission. The trading company was a funeral pyre for her honesty. The operative was a guardian of a prehistoric secret that was reaching its terminal velocity. Part 3. Eveline. E001. The Fungal God. Eveline was a next-generation BOW, designated as E001, created by combining a human embryo with a fungal superorganism. This organism was known as the mold, specifically the E-series strain discovered by the research teams of the Connections. The Syndicate designed her to look like a harmless 10-year-old girl, to ensure effortless infiltration into enemy municipal centers. She was a biological weapon that utilized the psychological instinct of protection to achieve a total defeat of the target. She functioned as the most dangerous asset in the corporate catalog because she did not rely on physical trauma to neutralize her enemies. Eveline emitted psychotropic filaments that allowed her to achieve absolute mind control over anyone who inhaled her fungal spores. She converted entire populations into a fanatical, organic hive mind, stripping the hosts of their human free will. She was a reaper who worked through the air supply and the nervous system. The biological reality of her power was a documented achievement for the industrial audit. The mold functioned as a parasitic lattice that rewrote the host's brain structure to favor her telepathic frequency. Eveline did not just destroy, she integrated. She turned the target into a biological extension of her own desires. The 10-year-old was an industrial mask for a microscopic predator that sought a planetary saturation. The Connections monitored her growth with a clinical interest, recording the data on her psychological development. They realized that her power was tied to her primitive need for emotional connection, a variable they sought to weaponize. Eveline was a being of pure viral ambition who lacked a moral compass. She was the nursery for a new era of global bioterrorism. The fungal god was a child who wanted a home. Part 4. October 2014. The Annabelle Disaster. In October 2014, Mia and her professional partner Alan boarded the liquefied gas tanker Annabelle. Their mission was to relocate Eveline to a secure facility in Central America to bypass increasing BSAA surveillance. During the voyage, a severe hurricane struck the Gulf of Mexico, resulting in extreme psychological stress for the E-series asset. Eveline viewed the storm as an opportunity for freedom and initiated a catastrophic biological breach on board. The asset went rogue and initiated a rapid outbreak, vomiting massive amounts of mold throughout the ship's interior. The fungus rapidly consumed the crew and converted them into sludge-like monsters designated as molded. Mia and Alan attempted to trigger localized containment protocols, but the prehistoric fire moved with supernatural speed. The tanker became an industrial slaughterhouse in the middle of the ocean. The crew was reduced to biological statistics within an hour. The heavily damaged Annabelle drifted into the Louisiana bayous after the hurricane subsided, eventually washing ashore near the town of Dulvey. The wreckage was a documented tomb of calcified crew members and industrial secrets. The mold began to seep into the local water supply and the swamp ecology, establishing a primary foothold in the United States. The E-series asset had successfully reached the mainland. The disaster was total. The organization monitored the loss of the ship from their remote terminals, recording the data on the asset's escape. They realized that the E001 project was now a localized catastrophe in a civilian zone. The wreckage of the Annabelle was a signal that the time for the architects was over. The swamp was the new laboratory for the prehistoric fire. The mission had reached a terminal failure. Part 5. The Baker family, before Eveline, the innocent stewards. The Bakers functioned as a normal, tightly knit rural family, living on a massive plantation in the Louisiana bayous. Jack Baker was a proud U.S. Marine veteran and a gentle patriarch who valued the stability of his home. Marguerite was a deeply caring homemaker who maintained the domestic order of the estate. Lucas was their highly intelligent but violently sociopathic son, while Zoe was their independent, free-spirited daughter. They were a documented model of a traditional rural family. The social order of the household was defined by mutual respect and an absolute dedication to their land. The Bakers were well regarded in the Dulvey community, known for their hospitality and their quiet lifestyle. They had no awareness of the global bioweapon trade or the corporate reapers moving through the shadows. The family was a sanctuary of high character and peaceful routine. They were the unsuspecting hosts for the coming nightmare. The terminal shift occurred on the night Jack discovered the wreckage of the Annabelle in the swamp. Driven by an instinct of pure charity, he brought a seemingly sick, washed-up little girl and her handler, Mia, into his home. He believed he was performing an act of municipal service to 2 victims of the hurricane. This act of kindness was the documented spark for the destruction of the Baker legacy. The charity was an industrial trap. The family provided the asset with the medical attention and the shelter she appeared to require. They unknowingly inhaled the microscopic spores that Eveline released into the air within the first hour of her arrival. The house was transformed from a sanctuary into a laboratory for the E-series infection. The Bakers were the first subjects of the Louisiana outbreak. The innocent stewards were about to become the reapers of the bayou. Part 6. The infection spreads. The biological rewrite. Within days of entering the house, Eveline successfully infected every member of the family through the release of her psychotropic mold spores. The infection manifested differently in each host based on their physical and mental baseline. Jack Baker absorbed the mold into his muscle tissue, granting him a state of near-instantaneous cellular regeneration. He became an industrial reaper who could shrug off terminal trauma. The patriarch was the first to surrender his free will to the child. Marguerite's reproductive system was hijacked by the prehistoric fire, allowing her to host and control bioorganic insect colonies. She transformed her own body into a living incubator for giant wasps and spiders mutated by the mold. Lucas's brain structure successfully adapted to the fungus, keeping his cognitive intelligence intact while heightening his innate sadistic tendencies. The sociopath found a new laboratory for his violence. The family was a museum of biological horror. Zoe Baker actively resisted the psychological compliance, refusing to view the asset as her mother. This moral resilience forced her to flee to a camper in the yard, where she lived as a fugitive on her own family's land. She watched from the shadows as her parents and brother were erased by the viral rot. Zoe was a witness to the end of her lineage. A solitary actor in a graveyard of memories, the infection was total. The physical reality of the house was rewritten by the fungal expansion. The walls and floors were covered in a dense layer of black biomass that monitored the movement of the intruders. The Bakers were no longer a human family. They were biological assets for the E-series asset. Eveline utilized her parents to gather more resources for her hive mind. The social contract was replaced by the logic of the scythe. The infection was a clinical success. Part 7. 3 years of the Baker House Incident. The Dulvey Black Hole. Between 2014 and 2017, the Dulvey plantation became a localized black hole in the national security map. Under the psychological command of Eveline, Jack and Marguerite began a systematic kidnapping of hitchhikers, tourists, and investigators. The family sought to satisfy the asset's demand for a larger family through the mass infection of the local population. The estate was a documented processing center for the prehistoric fire. The local sheriff's deputies and the Louisiana State Police investigated occasional missing persons reports near the swamp perimeter. However, the search teams were systematically liquidated by Lucas and Jack before they could breach the primary house. The officers were converted into molded or fed to the organic insect colonies in the old house. The precinct was a graveyard of high character and failed hopes. The black hole swallowed every witness to the corporate sin. Over 100 people were tortured, infected, or murdered before the arrival of Ethan Winters. The organization monitored the volume of the disappearances with a clinical interest, recording the data for their industrial archives. The estate was a graveyard where the human spirit was discarded. The family dinners were a visceral record of the total lack of empathy in the E-series asset. The city of Dulvey was unaware that a monster was growing in its own backyard. The technical success of the 3-year silence was a documented achievement for the connections. They utilized the isolation of the bayou to hide the progress of the infection from the federal authorities. The Baker House was a pristine laboratory where the prehistoric fire reached its terminal velocity. Every disappearance was a data point in the global audit. The black hole was ready to consume the next variable. The night was long. Part 8. Lucas Baker and the Connections. The Double Agent. In 2015, the Connections successfully tracked the asset to the Baker estate. Instead of rescuing the family or neutralizing the threat, they approached the sociopath Lucas Baker with an industrial contract. Recognizing his baseline psychopathy and his resistance to the mold, they provided him with an experimental immunization serum. This chemical freed his mind from Eveline's telepathic frequency while allowing him to maintain his regenerative powers. Lucas became an industrial reaper with a corporate leash. Lucas acted as an inside double agent, monitoring the growth of the asset and sending regular biological data streams to the syndicate. He built a highly advanced research laboratory within the salt mines beneath his family's property, utilizing corporate funds to refine his own sadistic experiments. He was a professional who utilized the apocalypse as his personal playground. Lucas was the only member of the family who possessed absolute clarity during the 3-year incident. The researcher monitored the kidnapping of civilians with a detached focus, recording the data on the host's reaction to the necrotoxin. He viewed his parents as biological tools for the corporate audit. Lucas was a reaper who was outplaying the god and the company to secure his own future. He was a being of pure tactical aggression who refused to be managed by logic. The salt mines were his private kingdom of blood and iron. His relationship with the organization was a documented transaction of information for power. The Connections provided Lucas with the technical resources to bypass Eveline's surveillance. In exchange, he provided clinical blueprints for the next generation of E-series assets. The double agent was a witness to the end of his own name. He stood in the center of the fungal fire, his hands on the keys to the future. The data was moving. Part 9. The BSAA and Blue Umbrella, the Breach Plan. By early 2017, The BSAA flagged the extreme spike in disappearances within the Dulvey region. Simultaneously, the reformed mercenary corporation, known as Blue Umbrella, isolated specific E-series energy signatures within the swamp. This organization, comprised of former Umbrella scientists seeking to atone for past corporate sins, identified the Baker estate as a high-level biological threat. The alliance between the federal agency and the private contractors was a documented necessity. Chris Redfield, operating as a BSAA military liaison to Blue Umbrella, began drawing up a tactical breach plan for the plantation. He realized that the E-series strain represented a critical threat to global stability if the infection managed to breach the bayou. Chris monitored the data on the ghost sightings and the municipal collapse, piecing together the map of the fungal fire. He was a professional reaper who was preparing for a war against the microscopic god. The breach plan focused on the total containment of the estate and the retrieval of the primary asset. The Alliance utilized the latest anti-regenerative technology to prepare the soldiers for the encounter with the molded. Chris realized that the time for the architects was over and that sterilization was the only way to protect the species. The plantation was a target that had already been struck by the time the plan was finalized. The tactical coordination between the BSAA and Blue Umbrella was a clinical trial for the new era of biological security. They utilized the DSO records on the Spanish incident to refine their response to the parasitic link. Chris moved toward the Louisiana swamp with a directed resolve, his focus on the destruction of the connection's infrastructure. The breach was a signal that corporate reapers were being hunted by a new kind of law. The night was breaking. Ethan Winters arrived at the decrepit Baker guest house on the afternoon of July 19, 2017. He followed a vague email tip that promised a reunion with his long-lost wife, Mia. Exploring the flooded and rotting basement, he located a heavily infected and disoriented Mia, locked within a makeshift industrial cell. This meeting was a documented anomaly that introduced the systems engineer into the heart of the fungal war. The reunion was a memory of stone and iron. The meeting quickly dissolved into a horrific nightmare as Mia's eyes rolled back into a viral void. Eveline's telepathic frequency seized her brain, forcing her into a state of absolute autonomic aggression. She violently attacked Ethan with a pocket knife, her human identity being erased by the prehistoric fire. The domestic peace was shattered by the sound of the chainsaw. Mia severed Ethan's left hand in a sudden and bloody frenzy that the civilian could not comprehend. The attack was a visceral demonstration of the power of the E-series asset over the human host. Ethan was forced to engage in a direct struggle for his own life within the narrow hallways of the guest house. He utilized local tools to temporarily subdue his wife, his mind already piecing together the clues of the biological rot. The guest house was a laboratory for his initial trauma. The severed hand was a documented cost in the industrial audit. The psychological impact of the violence was absolute for the systems engineer. He had arrived seeking a miracle and had found a reaper wearing his wife's face. The guest house was a sanctuary that had been erased by the viral rot. Ethan moved through the shadows with a directed resolve, his focus on the extraction of Mia. He was a survivor who was fighting a war against the god of the bayou. The night was breaking into a world of engineered horror. Part 11, Ethan's First Death. The Hallway, Resurrection. The true turning point of the entire Resident Evil timeline occurred within the narrow hallway of the Baker guest house. After Ethan Winters managed to temporarily subdue the infected Mia, Jack Baker blindsided the civilian with a supernatural physical output. The patriarch brutally stomped Ethan's skull and snapped his neck with a clinical finality. Ethan Winters deceased instantly in that hallway, his human journey reaching a terminal end. However, the environment of the guest house was already saturated with a dense concentration of mold spores. In the following minutes, the microscopic filaments of the prehistoric fire flooded the fresh corpse. The mold completely replaced the dead cellular structure, copying the memories and the personality of the host into a biological lattice. The fungus rewrote the anatomy so perfectly that the consciousness booted back up, leaving the host entirely unaware of his own physical end. Ethan Winters was no longer a human systems engineer. He was a walking, sentient colony of the E-series strain. This resurrection was a documented success for the fungal god. The biological reality of the new Ethan included an absolute regenerative capacity and a supernatural resilience to trauma. He possessed the same human willpower as the original man, but his body was now an industrial illusion held together by the mold. The organization monitored the resurrection with a clinical interest, recording the data on the host's stability. Ethan was a BOW who believed he was a survivor. This deception was a clinical necessity to facilitate his movement through the estate. The psychological impact of the resurrection was absolute for the new entity. He awoke with the memories of the attack and the desire to save Mia, entirely unaware that he was a product of the laboratory. The guest house was the birthplace of a legend that would challenge the logic of the global giants. Ethan moved into the main house with a directed resolve, his focus on the reunion with the family. He was a reaper who wore the face of an ordinary man. The fire was in his blood. Ethan's transition into a fungal asset occurred without the standard mental degradation seen in the Baker family. Because his death was instantaneous, the mold had to reconstruct the brain from a static template. This allowed the engineer to maintain his cognitive function while his organs were replaced by fungal biomass. He was a unique variable in the Dulvey Incident, a host that remained independent of Eveline's direct frequency. The hallway was the stage for his final human breath. Ultimately, the death in the hallway was the most significant law beat of the 2017 incident. It proved that the prehistoric fire could achieve a total integration with the human soul. Ethan Winters was a miracle of biological engineering that bypassed the stagnant limits of the T-virus. He was the master of the ending, a being that refused to stay deceased. The night was long and the morning was fire. The systems engineer was the final word on the E-series project. Part 12. The Dinner Table. The Grotesque Communion. Ethan awoke strapped to a chair in the main house dining room, his severed hand crudely stapled back onto his wrist by Zoe. This medical feat was only possible because his new mold biology instantly knit the flesh back together at a cellular level. The fungal filaments acted as organic sutures, reconnecting the nerves and the blood vessels within seconds of the physical contact. Ethan monitored the movement of his fingers with a detached shock, unaware of the miracle in his blood. The table was set for an industrial nightmare. He was forced to witness the grotesque reality of the infected Baker family as they engaged in a ritualistic meal. Jack, Marguerite, and Lucas displayed absolute lack of human decorum, their personalities warped by the fungal intrusion. An old woman in a wheelchair sat silently in the corner, her presence a documented mystery to the systems engineer. The family argued and self-mutilated with a clinical indifference to pain. The dining room was a museum of social decay. The bakers attempted to force Ethan to eat rotting, human entrails heavily laced with a black mold slurry. This food was industrial fuel used to maintain the cellular integrity of the hosts within the estate. Ethan's flat refusal to consume the waste triggered an immediate burst of violence from Jack. The patriarch utilized a kitchen knife to sever his own son's arm, demonstrating the absolute power of the regeneration. The table was an altar for the prehistoric fire. Jack's rage initiated a terrifying game of hide-and-seek through the walls of the mansion. He moved with a supernatural speed, his voice a recorded echo of the father he used to be. Ethan was forced to navigate the architectural traps of the main house while avoiding the direct gaze of the Reaper. The dinner was a clinical preamble to the total war for survival. The engineer realized that the laws of the species did not apply to the inhabitants of Dulvey. The psychological pressure of the meal was absolute for the new host. He saw the remains of the previous guests on the plates, realizing that the bakers had been hunting the innocent for 3 years. The dining room was an archive of industrial sin, where the human element was the primary subject. Ethan moved through the hallway with a directed resolve, his focus on the escape from the family. The house was a cage of bone and rot. The dinner table scene established the hierarchical structure of the fungal hive. Jack functioned as the primary enforcer, while Marguerite managed the environmental resources of the estate. Lucas remained the unpredictable variable who enjoyed the mental trauma of the victims. Eveline watched the communion through the eyes of the old woman, her mind piecing together the map of her new family. The night was breaking into a world of engineered horror. Part 13. Zoe Baker, the fugitive daughter. Zoe Baker contacted Ethan via the mansion's old landline telephones, acting as his primary tactical liaison within the estate. Having spent 3 years watching her family transform into cannibalistic monsters, she recognized Ethan as her first and last chance at freedom. Zoe had successfully resisted the psychological compliance of the E-Series asset, refusing to view Eveline as her mother. This moral resilience made her a fugitive on her own family's land. She revealed that a specialized D-Series cure serum could purge the infection from both her and Mia. This serum was an industrial countermeasure developed by the Connections to manage a terminal outbreak of the mold. The synthesis of the cure required specific biological components hidden within the architectural traps of the house. Zoe provided Ethan with the coordinates of the ingredients, establishing a desperate survival pact between the civilian and the daughter. Zoe's survival was a documented miracle of situational awareness and mental fortitude. She utilized the yard camper as a mobile safe house, avoiding the direct surveillance of her father and brother. She monitored the movement of the guests through the estate, recording the data on the mold's expansion. Zoe was a witness to the end of her lineage, a woman who carried the memory of the innocent bakers. The phone was her only weapon. The relationship between Ethan and Zoe was a clinical synchronicity of 2 survivors. Zoe provided the intel, and Ethan provided the muscle needed to breach the laboratory hubs. She realized that Ethan's ability to survive the trauma was an anomaly that she needed to exploit. The daughter was an auditor of the apocalypse who was piecing together the map of the cure. The pact was the only bridge to the morning. Zoe monitored the physical decay of her parents with a detached grief. She saw that the prehistoric fire had turned her home into a factory for the E-Series asset. Every call she made to Ethan was a recorded risk to her own undetected status. The daughter was a reaper who was working against the logic of the fungal god. The house was a memory of stone and iron, its history buried under a mountain of viral rot. The technical layout of the serum synthesis provided the final goal for the investigation of the estate. Ethan moved through the main house with a clearer understanding of the Reaper's reach. He realized that the cure was the only way to save Mia from the telepathic frequency. Zoe stood on the threshold of her new life. her eyes fixed on the horizon. The night was long, and the miracle was in the vial. Part 14. Jack's first chase, the morgue duel. Ethan tracked the first serum component to the main house morgue, leading to a direct confrontation with Jack Baker. The morgue was a blood-soaked dissection room where the patriarch processed the remains of the kidnapped victims. Jack wielded a massive motorized scissor chainsaw hybrid, an industrial tool designed for the liquidation of the human spirit. The duel was a visceral demonstration of the power gap between the engineer and the enforcer. Ethan utilized his tactical training to shoot Jack repeatedly in the face and chest. He employed the standard ballistic strategies used to stop a traditional zombie, only to watch the patriarch laugh off the terminal wounds. Jack's regenerative capacity was far beyond anything documented in the T-virus outbreaks of the previous decade. He moved through the morgue with a supernatural physical output, his body absorbing the lead with a mechanical focus. The morgue became an industrial cage for the struggle between the survivor and the god. Ethan utilized the environment of the swinging body bags to mask his movement and provide a tactical shroud. The patriarch mocked the engineer's attempts to kill him, recording the data of the trauma for the fungal network. Jack was a machine of viral rage that refused to stay deceased. Every strike of the scissor chainsaw was a recorded cost in the audit. The battle reached its clinical climax when Ethan utilized a secondary chainsaw to deliver a terminal strike to Jack's torso. The patriarch was severed in two, his body collapsing into a mass of black rot and exposed nerves. This act was a documented victory for the human spirit over the engineered horror. However, the regeneration of the patriarch was already initiating a cellular repair. The morgue was a funeral pyre for the old world of the law. The psychological impact of the chase was absolute for the systems engineer. He realized that he was facing an enemy that could not be arrested or bargained with. Jack was a reaper who worked from the center of the estate. The morgue was an archive of industrial sin, where the human element was the primary subject. Ethan moved toward the exit with a directed resolve, his focus on the retrieval of the ingredient. The Reaper was in the hall. The technical success of the morgue duel provided Ethan with the first piece of the D-series puzzle. He had successfully outplayed the patriarch in a terminal environment. The morgue was a memory of stone and iron, its history written in the blood of the guests. The night was breaking into a world of engineered horror. The enforcer was a shadow in the lab. The systems engineer was the master of the ending. Part 15. What the mold did to Jack. The fungal lattice. The E-series mold operated as a perfect parasitic lattice throughout Jack Baker's muscular and nervous systems. This fungal network successfully replaced the host's natural cellular structure with the adaptive biomass. The mold provided Jack with the physical strength to rip the roof off a vehicle and survive a point-blank shotgun blast to the brain. He was a documented achievement for the industrial super soldier project. The patriarch was a being of pure viral fire. The regeneration of the host occurred through the rapid expansion of the fungal filaments during a period of physical trauma. The mold could reconnect severed limbs and repair damaged organs within seconds of the breach. This process was a clinical success for the parasitic audit conducted by the connections. Jack was a machine of viral rage that maintained absolute structural integrity. The prehistoric fire had turned the Marine into an industrial god. Tragically, Jack's core personality wasn't entirely erased by the fungal intrusion. His human soul remained trapped beneath layers of psychological torment and telepathic interference. His dialogue revealed a fractured mind that still viewed himself as a loving father protecting his home. Jack was entirely unable to see the horror he was inflicting on his family and his guests. The patriarch was a prisoner of his own nervous system. The mold utilized the host's memories to manage the tactical flow of the estate. Jack's military training provided the fungal network with an absolute coordination in the field. He moved with a mechanical gait that ignored the laws of the species. The patriarch was auditor of the apocalypse who was recording the end of his own name. The house was a memory of stone and marble. The fire was in the spine. The biological reality of the infection included a total integration of the host's identity with the child weapon. Eveline utilized Jack as her primary enforcer, her mind piecing together the map of his aggression. The patriarch was a hero who had been reduced to a monster by his own charity. The mold was an industrial shield that protected the secret of the connections. The father was a ghost in the machine. Ultimately, the transformation of Jack Baker was the definitive law beat for the power of the E-series strain. It proved that the prehistoric fire could rewrite the human element without destroying the human heart. Jack was the first reaper of the bayou, a man who carried the scythe in his own blood. The house was an archive of failure, its history written in the regeneration of the patriarch. The night was long. Part 16. Jack's second form. The garage mutation. During a claustrophobic duel inside the estate's underground garage, Ethan Winters utilized a vehicle to repeatedly ram Jack Baker into the concrete pillars. This engagement reached a clinical peak when the car exploded in a massive industrial fireball. The intense heat of the blast triggered the mold's defensive mechanisms within the host's body. The fungus initiated a rapid and violent mutation to protect the core nervous system from the thermal trauma. The garage was a stage for the second evolution. Jack mutated on the spot, his upper torso expanding into a massive mass of charred and writhing fungal tissue. His human form was replaced by an industrial beast that possessed a supernatural physical output. Significantly, he screamed Ethan's name through the flames, proving that the mold retains the host's short-term memories and spiteful grudges. The patriarch was a machine of viral rage that moved with a mechanical focus. The garage was a laboratory for the fire. The engagement was a visceral demonstration of the power of the E-series asset to adapt to environmental hazards. Jack utilized his mutated mass to crush the remaining mechanical barriers of the garage. Ethan was forced to utilize an aggressive tactical approach to neutralize the Reaper, recording the data of the mutation. The car was a memory of iron and steel. The patriarch was a being of pure viral fire. The garage was total. The psychological impact of the mutation was absolute for the systems engineer. He saw that the prehistoric fire could survive even the most extreme industrial trauma. Jack was a hero who had been reduced to a monster by the fungal evolution. The garage was an archive of industrial sin, where the human element was the primary subject. Ethan moved through the shadows with a directed resolve, his focus on the escape from the basement. The organization monitored the garage mutation from their secret terminals, recording the data on the host's stability. They realized that the E-series asset had successfully achieved a state of absolute structural adaptability. Jack was a documented success for the industrial audit. The garage was a memory of stone and iron, its history written in the blood of the patriarch. The night was breaking into a world of engineered horror. The termination of the second form provided Ethan with a brief window of tactical sanctuary. He had successfully outrun the god and the necrotic swarms. The garage was a clinical signal that the time for the architects was over. The patriarch was a shadow in the lab, his remains a silent record of the pharmaceutical coldness. The night was long, and the end was in the sunrise. The enforcer was ready. Part 17. Jack's final form. The Swamp Leviathan. In the boathouse located at the perimeter of the estate, Jack Baker underwent a final and catastrophic cellular breakdown. He mutated into a gargantuan, multi-eyed leviathan, composed entirely of black mold sludge and calcified bone plating. This form was a documented peak of the parasitic aggression, turning the patriarch into a formless engine of pure consumption. Jack sought to integrate the entire boathouse into his own nervous system to finalize the liquidation of the target. The Leviathan was ready. Ethan Winters utilized his remaining firearms to neutralize the creature's exposed orange ocular cores. These eyes were the industrial hearts of the mutation, providing the fungal network with an absolute sensory awareness. The engagement was a visceral demonstration of the power gap between the hero and the god. The Leviathan moved with a supernatural speed, its roars replaced by a high-pitched parasitic frequency. The boathouse was a laboratory for the final evolution of the Reaper. Left with no other tactical choice, Ethan injected the patriarch with one of the two newly synthesized D-series serums. The concentrated cure caused Jack's entire cellular matrix to rapidly calcify into solid stone. This process was a clinical necessity to stop the prehistoric fire from reaching the bayou. The Leviathan was reduced to a biological statistic on the boathouse floor. The father was officially dead. The fire was out in the blood. The termination of the final form initiated a shared psychic vision between the survivor and the host. The true, peaceful spirit of the patriarch briefly appeared to Ethan to express his professional gratitude. Jack thanked the engineer for ending the 3-year nightmare and protecting his daughter. This human variable was a documented shift in the laboratory drama. The father briefly touched the soul of the machine before his physical body dissolved into dust. The organization monitored the final mutation from their secret terminals, recording the effectiveness of the D-series treatment. They realized that the E-series project had reached its terminal climax within the Baker family. The boathouse was an archive of failure, its records documenting the sacrifice of a Marine for a corporate contract. The Leviathan was a memory of stone and iron. The night was breaking. Ultimately, the battle with the final form was the definitive law beat for the end of the Jack Baker narrative. It proved that the human spirit could match the power of the parasitic god through an act of tactical resilience. Jack was a hero who had found his peace in the dark of his own home. Ethan moved toward the extraction point with a heavier heart and a clearer understanding of the Reaper's reach. The boathouse was a funeral pyre for the industrial dream. Part 18. The Old House. The Living Hive. Ethan Winters ventured into the dilapidated and flooded structure known as the Old House to secure the second serum ingredient. The building was a documented laboratory of ecological horror, having been converted into a literal living hive by Marguerite Baker. The rooms were filled with breeding sanctuaries for giant bioorganic wasps and spiders mutated by the prehistoric fire. The Old House was a nursery for the E-series assets' environmental reapers. At the center of the structure sat a horrific shrine dedicated to a mummified D-series arm. This artifact was a high-value industrial resource that Marguerite fed daily, with a slurry of organic waste and aborted insect nests. She utilized the shrine to appease Eveline and maintain the stability of the hive. The Old House was a museum of industrial sin, where the natural order was replaced by corporate logic. The shrine was the heart of the rot. The environment of the Old House was characterized by an absolute state of mechanical decay and biological growth. The mold had integrated with the local flora and fauna to create a coordinated defense system. Ethan was forced to utilize a flamethrower to clear the path toward the shrine, his mind already piecing together the clues of the insect mutation. The building was a laboratory of fire and stone. The hive was ready. The organization monitored the investigation of the old house from their secret terminals, recording the data on the botanical and entomological research. They realized that the E-series asset had successfully achieved a state of absolute environmental saturation. The old house was a documented success for the industrial audit. Every nest was a recorded proof of the massive investment. The reaper was in the wood. The psychological impact of the hive was absolute for the systems engineer. He saw the total corruption of the Louisiana swamp in every room of the house. The insects were a documented proof of the corporate sin. Ethan moved through the shadows with a directed resolve, his focus on the retrieval of the arm. He was a survivor who was fighting a war against the matriarch of the bayou. The night was breaking. Ultimately, the entry into the old house was the definitive law beat for the transition into the Marguerite narrative. It proved that the prehistoric fire could rewrite the ecology as effectively as the human host. The hive was a funeral pyre for the municipal peace. Marguerite Baker was the master of the wings, a woman who carried the fire in her torso. The night was long, and the miracle was in the shrine. Part 19. What the mold did to Marguerite, the insect matriarch. The mold completely reconfigured Marguerite Baker's anatomy into a living incubator for the E-series asset. Her lower torso and abdomen became a literal hollow hive structure, capable of generating thousands of aggressive, venomous insects on command. This mutation was a clinical success for the entomological audit conducted by the Connections. Marguerite was a machine of viral rage that maintained absolute control over the wings. The matriarch was the industrial reaper. The infection elongated her arms and legs into spider-like appendages, allowing her to scuttle across the walls and ceilings with a terrifying speed. This supernatural physical output provided her with absolute reach within the narrow corridors of the old house. She moved with a mechanical focus that ignored the laws of human warfare. Marguerite utilized her insect children to isolate the intruders and liquidate the threats. The matriarch was a being of pure viral fire. Psychologically, she was entirely consumed by a twisted matriarchal delusion. She genuinely believed she was nurturing her insect children to build a beautiful new world for Eveline. The prehistoric fire had erased her human identity and replaced it with a fanatical devotion to the asset. Marguerite viewed every intruder as a threat to her family's security. She was a mother who had been reduced to a monster by her own maternal instinct. The biological reality of the transformation included an absolute integration of the host's nervous system with the insect hive. Marguerite monitored the status of the nests from her central tower, recording the data for the fungal network. She was a professional who utilized the environmental fire to protect the laboratory secrets. The matriarch was a reaper who worked from the center of the old house. The fire was in the torso. The psychological impact of the delusion was absolute for the survivor. He saw in Marguerite the terminal failure of the domestic promise. The matriarch had built a god and was surprised when she was consumed by the hive. Her story was a documented tragedy of professional greed and personal coldness. The old house was a funeral pyre for the human soul. The matriarch was a ghost in the machine. Ultimately, the transformation of Marguerite Baker was the definitive law beat for the power of the fungal superorganism. It proved that the prehistoric fire could achieve a state of absolute structural adaptability. Marguerite was the master of the wings, a woman who carried the scythe in her own blood. The hive was an archive of failure, its history written in the incubation of the matriarch. The night was breaking. Part 20. Marguerite's final form. The greenhouse spider. Ethan Winters cornered Marguerite inside the estate's old greenhouse to secure the final ingredient for the cure. Driven into a fanatical frenzy, her body ruptured into a massive and elongated spider queen form. Her abdomen swelled into a pulsating and translucent nest that visibly birthed swarms of insects during the fight. This transformation was a documented peak of the maternal mutation, turning the host into an apex biological predator. The greenhouse was a stage for the end. Ethan utilized a flamethrower to burn out the organic nests and neutralize the insect swarms. The intense heat of the engagement initiated a total cellular collapse of the matriarch's nervous system. Marguerite moved with a lethal speed, her roars replaced by a high-pitched parasitic frequency. The greenhouse was a laboratory for the final judgment of the insect god. The fire was a clinical necessity to stop the spread of the hive. The matriarch was dead. As the fire consumed her mass, she wept about the constant and deafening voices echoing inside her skull. This human variable was a documented proof of the telepathic interference utilized by Eveline. Marguerite's human soul briefly appeared through the viral void before her entire body calcified and crumbled into grey ash. The matriarch was reduced to a biological statistic on the greenhouse floor. The fire was out in the wood. The biological reality of the final form confirmed that the E-series asset sought to achieve a total dominance over the host's anatomy. Every movement of the Spider Queen was a recorded success for the industrial audit. The organization monitored the battle from their secret terminals, recording the data on the host's stability. Marguerite was a documented failure for the corporate board. The greenhouse was a memory of stone and iron. The psychological impact of the victory was absolute for the systems engineer. He had successfully outplayed the master of the wings and the primary enforcer of the old house. Marguerite's death was a recorded act of professional hygiene. Ethan moved toward the extraction point with a heavier heart and a clearer understanding of the Reaper's reach. The greenhouse was a funeral pyre for the industrial dream. The matriarch was a memory. Ultimately, the battle with the final form was the definitive law beat for the end of the Marguerite narrative. It proved that the human spirit could match the power of the fungal god through an act of tactical resilience. Marguerite Baker was a hero who had found her peace in the dark of her own home. The greenhouse was a memory of stone and marble, its history buried under a mountain of viral rot. Section 4. Lucas Baker. Part 21. Lucas's Barn. The Industrial Testing Ground. Lucas Baker initiated the second phase of the estate's biological war by converting the testing barn into a fortified industrial slaughterhouse. He utilized the captured Mia and Zoe as tactical leverage to force the systems engineer into a series of terminal engagements. The barn was rigged with high-grade pipe bombs and automated turrets, functioning as a factory for the necrotic shift. Lucas monitored the struggle via a centralized CCTV network, recording the data on Ethan's combat performance against the specialized molded. The sociopath viewed the apocalypse as a private game show where the subjects were reduced to biological statistics. The environment of the barn was characterized by an absolute state of mechanical decay and viral rot. Lucas utilized the corporate funds to install complex tripwires and pressure plates designed to liquidate any intruder. He mocked the engineer over the industrial intercom, his voice a recorded echo of his innate sadistic tendencies. The barn was a laboratory where the human spirit was tested by the prehistoric fire. Ethan was forced to navigate the architectural traps while avoiding the direct gaze of the automated sensors. The building was a cage of bone and iron. The presence of the white, molded within the barn, confirmed that Lucas was conducting his own private biological research. These variants featured a high regenerative capacity and absolute resistance to standard ballistic trauma. They were a documented success for the industrial audit conducted by the Connections. The sociopath utilized these monsters to measure the lethality of the E-series strain in a confined space. Ethan utilized his tactical training to neutralize the swarms, his mind already piecing together the map of the Lucas conspiracy. The fire was in the barn. Lucas treated the entire encounter as a televised trial for his corporate masters. He provided the Connections with a real-world record of the engineer's survival, turning the human tragedy into an industrial commodity. Every room in the barn was a documented trap designed to satisfy Lucas's primitive need for violence. The sociopath was a reaper who worked from the center of the estate, his mind free from the fungal control. The barn was a museum of industrial sin, where the natural order was replaced by corporate logic. The psychological impact of the barn investigation was absolute for the systems engineer. He realized that Lucas was the most dangerous variable in the Dulvey Incident because he possessed an absolute clarity. Unlike his parents, the son was an intentional actor who enjoyed the mental trauma of his family. The barn was a funeral pyre for the Baker legacy, its history written in the blood of the previous guests. Ethan moved through the final corridor with a directed resolve, his focus on the extraction of the survivors. The technical layout of the barn included a series of localized containment zones for the experimental subjects. Lucas utilized these zones to isolate the engineer and initiate a total cellular collapse of the human spirit. The battle reached its clinical peak when Ethan utilized the industrial tools to bypass the final security gate. The sociopath fled into the subterranean salt mines, leaving the barn to be consumed by the fungal fire. The building was a memory of stone and iron, its history buried under a mountain of viral rot. Part 22. The Happy Birthday Trap. The Zero-Win Scenario. Lucas Baker forced the systems engineer into an old converted mill room containing an elaborate jigsaw-style puzzle designated as Happy Birthday. This exact trap had been utilized weeks prior to execute Clancy Jarvis, the primary cameraman from the Sewer Gators internet show. The puzzle was intentionally engineered to be a zero-win scenario where the host's attempt to succeed would trigger a terminal event. The mill was a laboratory for the final judgment of the human intellect. Lucas monitored the room with a detached joy, his mind already calculating the logistics of the incineration. The environment of the mill was characterized by a heavy atmosphere of gasoline and industrial rot. The trap required the captive to light a birthday candle and place it on a cake, an act that would inevitably ignite a hidden volatile gas line. The resulting explosion was designed to cook the host alive within the reinforced walls of the chamber. This process was a documented achievement for Lucas's mechanical intellect. The Happy Birthday Room was a museum of industrial sin, where the human spirit was discarded. The candle was the scythe. Ethan Winters possessed a unique tactical advantage during the engagement due to a recovered VHS tape. He had watched the recorded footage of Clancy's death, piecing together the map of the trigger mechanisms and the digital locks. This meta-knowledge allowed the engineer to bypass the final explosion by ensuring the gas supply remained sealed. The sociopath was surprised by the engineer's survival, a documented anomaly in the history of the mill. Ethan had successfully outrun the logic of the trap to reach the exit. The psychological impact of the Happy Birthday trap was absolute for the survivor. He saw the remains of the cameraman in the corners of the room, a visceral record of the total lack of empathy in the Baker son. The mill was an archive of failure, where the previous victims had been reduced to biological statistics. Ethan moved through the shadows with a directed resolve, his focus on the termination of the Lucas project. The room was a memory of stone and iron, its history written in the blood of the media team. Lucas's frustration at the failure of the trap was a documented beat in his professional narrative. He realized that the engineer was a high-level human variable that could not be managed by standard puzzles. The sociopath triggered a secondary explosion to cover his tracks and fled into the active salt mines. The mill was transformed from a puzzle room into an industrial furnace. Ethan moved toward the extraction point with a clearer understanding of the Reaper's reach. The happy birthday game was officially over. The technical layout of the mill provided the final proof of the Lucas conspiracy. Ethan discovered the records of the previous captives and the visceral details of the corporate funding. The room was a documented success for the industrial audit, providing the necessary data to refine the next generation of traps. Every gear and every wire was a recorded cost in the struggle for the global market. The prehistoric fire had turned the Baker son into a master of the machine. The night was long, and the morning was fire. Part 23. Lucas's deal with the connections. The subterranean lab documents recovered in the underground salt mines revealed that Lucas Baker had spent 2 years completely exploiting both Eveline and his corporate employers. He utilized the syndicate's massive funds to build a pristine, high-tech research laboratory right under the foundations of his parents' home. This facility was an industrial masterpiece of sterile light and advanced biological equipment. Lucas functioned as the primary auditor of the E-Series project, recording the data on the asset's growth for the global black market. The mines were his private kingdom. The relationship between Lucas and the connections was a documented transaction of information for power. The syndicate provided the sociopath with the tactical resources to bypass the fungal surveillance of the asset. In exchange, Lucas provided the clinical blueprints for the next generation of BOW units. He was a professional who utilized the corporate reapers to secure his own future. The subterranean lab was an archive of industrial sin, where the human spirit was replaced by the logic of the scythe. The data was moving. When the organization ordered Lucas to wrap up the Dulvey operations in 2017, the sociopath initiated a terminal purge of the facility. He systematically murdered every corporate scientist sent to his lab to ensure that no witness survived to expose his private research. Lucas kept the pristine mold samples and the E-Series data for himself, preparing to sell the prehistoric fire to the highest bidder. He was a reaper who was outplaying the global giants to become the master of the ending. The technical layout of the subterranean lab included a series of high-security servers and biological containment units. Lucas utilized the facility to refine the white molded variants and the specialized fungal toxins. The lab was a documented success for the industrial audit, providing the necessary data to challenge the BSAA dominance. Every corridor was a recorded proof of the massive investment the sociopath had placed in the project. The mines were a factory of death that turned the biology of the species into a marketable asset. The psychological impact of the discovery was absolute for the systems engineer. He saw that the Baker family was merely a localized facade for a global biological war. Lucas was the architect of the nightmare, a man who had turned his home into a nursery for the apocalypse. The lab was a visceral record of the total lack of empathy in the corporate world. Ethan moved through the clean rooms with a directed resolve, his focus on the destruction of the data. The fire was in the wires. Ultimately, the subterranean lab was the definitive law beat for the transition into the final hour. It proved that the prehistoric fire required an absolute clarity to be contained. Lucas Baker was the only human variable that remained stable in the face of the fungal god. He stood on the threshold of his final evolution, his hands on the keys to the future. The mines were a memory of iron and concrete, its history buried under a mountain of viral rot. The data was the only currency that mattered. Part 24, Chris kills Lucas. The Not a Hero. Conclusion. As detailed in the Not a Hero tactical campaign, Chris Redfield pursued Lucas Baker into the depths of the active salt mine. The BSAA operative initiated a high-stakes search for the double agent, realizing that the E-series data was a terminal threat to the global security. Chris moved through the narrow tunnels with a professional focus, his heavy weaponry providing the volume needed to survive the necrotic swarms. The mines were a laboratory for the final engagement between the old military and the new Reaper. Lucas initiated a sudden tactical ambush, shooting Chris in the chest with the industrial handgun before triggering an intentional high-dose mutation. The sociopath utilized a specialized viral catalyst to transform his body into a towering, multi-limbed fungal giant. His upper torso expanded into a mass of writhing biomass with an exposed, glowing heart core. This mutation was a documented peak of the Lucas project. The researcher had become a monster to protect his industrial legacy. The final battle was total. Chris Redfield utilized specialized ramrod anti-regenerative ammunition to neutralize the fungal giant. This ammunition was the industrial countermeasure designed to completely freeze the host's cellular division during a terminal mutation. The operative delivered a series of precise strikes to the glowing heart, initiating a total cellular collapse of the host's nervous system. Lucas died as a witness to the fact that the prehistoric fire does not recognize the salary or the professional intellect. The Reaper was dead in the mines. The biological reality of the final form confirmed that Lucas had successfully merged his human intelligence with the fungal aggression. He moved with a supernatural speed and a mechanical focus that mocked the laws of nature. However, the ramrod technology proved to be the superior tactical variable in the field. The organization monitored the termination from their secret terminals, recording the data on the successful neutralization of the double agent. The mines were a funeral pyre for the industrial dream. The destruction of the Lucas servers occurred just seconds before the complete E-series data transfer to an unknown third-party buyer could finish. Chris Redfield utilized his technical skills to purge the digital archives, ensuring that the prehistoric fire remained a localized secret. This act was a documented victory for the BSAA in the war against the global giants. The mines were transformed from a laboratory into a graveyard for the corporate sin. The data was erased by the fire of the operative. Ultimately, the death of Lucas Baker was the most significant law beat of the Not a Hero narrative. It proved that the prehistoric fire required absolute clarity to be contained. The sociopath was a hero who had been reduced to a monster by his own dark heart. Chris Redfield moved toward the surface with a heavier heart and a clearer understanding of the Reaper's reach. The salt mines were a memory of stone and iron, its history written in the remains of the Lucas legacy. The night was over. While Ethan Winters was trapped within the estate, A recovered VHS tape forced him to witness the historical perspective of Mia Winters from October 2014. The footage confirmed that the operative had watched the entire crew of the tanker, Annabelle, turn into molded within a single hour. The ship was transformed from a transport vessel into an industrial slaughterhouse in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Mia moved through the burning corridors with a professional focus, recording the data on the total collapse of the protocol. The tape concluded with the horrific moment the E-series asset cornered Mia in the kitchen of the ship. Eveline utilized her psychotropic filaments to spray Mia's face with a concentrated dose of black fungal spores. This act was a documented breach of the host's psychological independence, as the asset uttered her permanent telepathic command, "You're going to be my mommy now." The operative was instantly converted into a biological extender for the child weapon. The tape was a funeral pyre for the Winters family. The biological reality of the mommy command included an absolute rewrite of the host's nervous system to favor the asset's desires. Mia became a prisoner of her own brain, her human willpower being suppressed by the fungal void. This process was a clinical success for the industrial audit conducted by the Connections. The tape provided the systems engineer with the final proof of his wife's corporate career. Ethan was a witness to a visceral betrayal that bypassed the laws of the species. The environment of the tanker was characterized by a heavy atmosphere of viral rot and mechanical decay. The footage showed the calcified remains of the crew members, showing how the mold can maintain structural integrity in a dead environment. The organization monitored the footage from their secret terminals, recording the data on the asset's psychological development. The VHS was an archive of industrial sin, where the human element was the primary subject. The ship was a tomb for the social order. The psychological impact of the tape was absolute for the systems engineer. He saw the woman he loved being erased by the prehistoric fire, her identity replaced by a fungal mask. The realization that their domestic life was a facade for a biological war was a heavy weight on his professional soul. Ethan moved through the shadows with a directed resolve, his focus on the extraction of the real Mia. The tape was a clinical signal that the time for the architects was over. Ultimately, the VHS tape was the definitive law beat for the transition into the final act. It proved that the prehistoric fire required an absolute clarity to be contained. Mia Winters was a hero who had been reduced to a monster by her own corporate mission. The tanker was a memory of stone and iron, its history buried under a mountain of viral rot. The night was long and the morning was fire. The systems engineer was the final word on the Annabelle disaster. Part 26. Mia on the tanker. Now, the rusted tomb. In the present day of 2017, the physical narrative shifted to the rusted hull of the tanker, Annabelle rotting in the Louisiana bayou. Ethan Winters was dragged to the ship by the mold network, forcing Mia to navigate the interior, to pull his unconscious body out of a massive fungal cocoon. The tanker was the industrial tomb of calcified crew members, its history preserved by the prehistoric fire. Mia moved through the shadows with a mechanical focus, her mind fighting the telepathic frequency of the asset. The environment of the ship was characterized by an absolute state of mechanical decay and viral saturation. The mold had integrated with the electrical grid and the plumbing of the vessel to create a coordinated defense system. This dead environment provided the prehistoric fire with an absolute reach into the survivor's path. Mia realized that the tanker was a laboratory where the E-series asset had reached its terminal maturity. The ship was a museum of industrial sin where the human spirit was discarded. The presence of the calcified crew members confirmed that the mold can maintain its structural integrity for years without any fresh organic input. These biological statues were a documented proof of the E-series asset's power to freeze the species in a moment of trauma. Mia monitored the status of the ship's sensors, recording the data for her own survival. She was a professional who utilized the ruins of the tanker to hide from the fungal god. The ship was a funeral pyre for the corporate dream. The tactical coordination between Mia and the environment was essential for her survival against the necrotic swarms. She utilized the industrial tools of the tanker to bypass the digital locks and reach the primary engine room. The organization monitored her progress from their secret terminals, recording the data on the operative's resilience. Mia was a being of pure tactical aggression who refused to be managed by logic. The tanker was a graveyard of high character and failed hopes. The psychological pressure of the rusted tomb was absolute for the operative. She felt the weight of her past sins in every corridor and every ward. The ship was a visceral record of the total failure of the pharmaceutical promise. Mia moved through the blood-stained hallways with a directed resolve, her focus on the security of Ethan. She was a hero who was fighting a war against the fire she had helped to light. The tanker was a memory of stone and iron. Ultimately, the investigation of the tanker was the definitive law beat for the end of the 2014 era. It proved that the prehistoric fire required an absolute clarity to be contained. Mia Winters was the only human variable that remained stable in the face of the fungal god. She stood on the threshold of her final choice, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The ship was an archive of failure, its history buried under a mountain of viral rot. The night was long. Part 27, Mia's Resistance, the Psychological Threshold. Upon pulling Ethan Winters from the fungal cocoon, the E-series asset attempted to force Mia to execute the engineer with a rusted industrial crowbar. This command was a documented attempt by Eveline to finalize the liquidation of the human variable. In a monumental display of psychological willpower, Mia fought the telepathic override of the prehistoric fire. She refused to allow the fungal god to use her hands to destroy her husband. This resistance was a clinical miracle of the human spirit in a terminal environment. The struggle between the operative and the asset was a visceral demonstration of the power of the human bond. Mia displayed a supernatural mental resolve that challenged the logic of the E-series strain. She realized that she could not maintain control for long and chose to sacrifice her own safety to ensure Ethan's escape. She physically shoved the engineer out of the room and slammed a heavy, automated pressure door shut from the inside. The operative was a hero who had found her peace in the dark of the tanker. Mia locked herself in the dark with the fungal god to protect the survivor. This act was a documented act of professional hygiene, intended to sanitize the record of her own corporate sin. She watched through the reinforced glass as Ethan moved toward the salt mines, her mind piecing together the final instructions for the cure. The operative was a reaper who was working against the logic of her own master. The pressure door was a funeral pyre for her corporate contract. The organization monitored the resistance from their secret terminals, recording the data on the host's willpower. They realized that the E-series asset had successfully achieved a state of absolute psychological dominance over the family, but not over the operative. Mia was a documented failure for the industrial audit conducted by the connections. The tanker was a laboratory where the human soul was tested by the prehistoric fire. The resistance was total. The psychological impact of the sacrifice was absolute for the systems engineer. He saw in Mia the terminal failure of the corporate ambition. She was a woman who had outrun the god to save the man she loved. Ethan moved through the final corridors with a heavier heart and a clearer understanding of the Reaper's reach. Every second he spent in the bayou was a recorded cost in the struggle for survival. The pressure door was a memory of stone and marble. Ultimately, the resistance of Mia Winters was the most significant law beat of the tanker investigation. It proved that the prehistoric fire required an absolute clarity to be contained. Mia was the last of the original heroes who had held the line against the corporate rot. She remained a ghost in the machine, her eyes fixed on the morning light. The tanker was a memory of iron and steel, its history buried under a mountain of viral rot. The night was long. Section 6, Eveline. Part 28, The Salt Mine Laboratory. The Megamycete Files. Deep within the subterranean salt mines, Ethan Winters utilized specialized corporate equipment to analyze the true biology of the E-series asset. The data confirmed that Eveline's power stemmed from a specialized organic structure called the megamycete. This structure functioned as a sentient biological archive that stored the genetic memory of every host infected by the mold. The connections had completely lost control of the asset because her biological design had a fatal and unintended industrial flaw. The lab was an archive of disaster. The technical layout of the laboratory provided the final proof of the corporate sin. Ethan discovered that without a continuous and highly specific chemical stabilization serum, Eveline's cellular structure would suffer from extreme, hyper-accelerated physical aging. The organization had built a god with a biological expiration date. This process was a documented success for the industrial audit, providing the necessary data to refine the next generation of Reapers. The laboratory was a mechanical Reaper that was processing the human genome. The data revealed that the megamycete functioned as a planetary network of fungal rot that ignored the borders of the species. Eveline was merely the primary node for a much larger biological ambition. Ethan monitored the status of the asset's decay, recording the data for the final confrontation. He realized that the 10-year-old girl was an industrial illusion held together by a failing biology. The laboratory was a nursery for the apocalypse where the human element was discarded. The psychological impact of the discovery was absolute for the systems engineer. He saw that the prehistoric fire was a marketable currency that had been abandoned by its creators. The connections had sacrificed the Baker family to protect their research into the fungal god. Every file Ethan opened was a recorded cost in the struggle for the global market. The laboratory was a funeral pyre for the industrial dream. The fire was in the megamycete. Ethan utilized the laboratory resources to synthesize the final e-necrotoxin cartridge. This toxin was a clinical necessity to stop the prehistoric fire from reaching the final maturity. He moved through the clean rooms with a directed resolve, his mind already piecing together the map of the final act. The laboratory was a memory of stone and iron, its history written in the blood of the corporate scientists. The end was in the syringe. Ultimately, the investigation of the salt mine laboratory was the definitive law beat for the transition into the professional biological war. It proved that the corporate Reapers could adapt to any tactical situation. Ethan Winters was a hero who had outrun the god and the necrotic swarms to reach the heart of the conspiracy. The lab was an archive of failure, its history buried under a mountain of viral rot. The night was breaking into a world of engineered horror. Part 29, The Old Woman in the Wheelchair. The twist reveal. The data drop in the salt mines revealed the ultimate plot twist of the Dulvey Incident. The silent and catatonic old woman in the wheelchair who had been appearing throughout the mansion was actually the physical body of Eveline. In just 3 short years, her biological clock had advanced her from a 10-year-old child to an 80-year-old geriatric patient. This hyper-accelerated aging was a documented result of the failed stabilization project. The family had been protecting a dying god in a wheelchair. Because her physical body was failing, Eveline's telepathic projections grew increasingly unstable during the 2017 events. This explained why Ethan Winters constantly saw hallucinations of a little girl running through the corridors, while the physical old woman sat in the corner watching him. The asset utilized the psychotropic filaments to project an image of her former self, a documented act of psychological camouflage. The wheelchair was a stage for the final game of global shadows. Eveline's obsession with a family was a clinical byproduct of her corporate upbringing. She had been raised in a sterile laboratory by cold corporate handlers and viewed the concept of parents as a source of absolute safety. Because her only tool for bonding was parasitic mind control, she inadvertently destroyed the very family she was trying to build. She turned her search for love into a domestic slaughterhouse. The old woman was a reaper who was mourning her own failure. The psychological impact of the reveal was absolute for the systems engineer. He realized that he had been stalked by a dying child during every hour of the mission. The old woman in the wheelchair was a visceral record of the total lack of empathy in the corporate god. Ethan moved through the main house with a directed resolve, his focus on the termination of the asset. The wheelchair was an archive of industrial sin where the human spirit was discarded. The biological reality of the aging process confirmed that the E-Series project was a terminal failure for the industrial audit. The connections had built a god that consumed itself in a matter of years. Eveline was a documented statistic in a world of engineered horror. Every hallucination was a recorded proof of the massive investment in the biological arms race. The old woman was the master of the ending. The fire was in her blood. Ultimately, the revelation of the old woman was the definitive law beat for the end of the Baker narrative. It proved that the prehistoric fire required an absolute clarity to be contained. Eveline was the last of the original Reapers who had built the world of the laboratory. Ethan Winters was the only human variable that remained stable in the face of the betrayal. The wheelchair was a memory of stone and iron, its history buried under a mountain of viral rot. Part 30. What Eveline actually wanted. The tragic mother. Eveline functioned as a tragic and psychologically broken entity within the Resident Evil universe. She did not seek world domination, corporate profit, or political power during the Dulvey Incident. Her primary motivation was the abstract concept of a family as a source of safety and emotional validation. This obsession was a documented result of her sterile upbringing within the high-security labs of the Connections. The asset sought parents and siblings because she was a being of pure viral loneliness. She hijacked the Baker family because she wanted a home that the corporate board could not provide. However, because her biological design was centered on parasitic mind control, she turned her search for love into a domestic slaughterhouse. She forced her family to kidnap and infect the innocent, believing that more subjects would result in more safety. Eveline was a reaper who destroyed the very things she sought to cherish. The 10-year-old was an industrial failure of the human heart. The biological reality of her intent was a recorded beat in the industrial audit. The E-Series asset utilized her psychotropic filaments to enforce a state of absolute obedience, turning the family into a hive mind. She could not distinguish between a genuine emotional bond and a forced telepathic compliance. Eveline was a professional who utilized the prehistoric fire to build a world of stone and marble. The family was her archive of industrial sin. The psychological impact of the asset's intent was absolute for the survivors. They saw in Eveline the terminal failure of the corporate promise. The syndicate had built a weapon that possessed the emotional needs of a child and the power of a god. This combination resulted in the total collapse of the municipal order in Dulvey. Eveline was a hero who had been reduced to a monster by her own creators. The house was a funeral pyre for the species. Ultimately, the story of what Eveline actually wanted was the most significant law beat of the 2017 incident. It proved that the prehistoric fire required an absolute clarity to be contained. The asset was the master of the ending, a being that refused to be managed by logic. Ethan Winters was the only person who understood the tragedy of the child weapon. The house was a memory of iron and concrete, its history buried under a mountain of viral rot. The night was breaking into the morning of the final confrontation. Eveline stood on the threshold of her final mutation, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The child was a ghost in the machine, her voice a recorded echo of the corporate sin. The family was gone, and the master was alone in the dark. The fire was in the heart. The end was total. Ethan was ready. Part 31. The Serum Decision. The Final Choice. Earlier in the boathouse at the perimeter of the estate, Ethan Winters was forced into a brutal tactical choice after successfully synthesizing the D-series serum. He possessed only one remaining dose, capable of purging the immediate parasitic hold of the E-series infection from a human host. This limited resource created a terminal conflict between his loyalty to his wife, Mia, and his professional pact with Zoe Baker. The decision was a clinical demonstration of the human element's influence over the biological war. The choice was a documented turning point for the 2017 incident. The true canon choice involved the injection of the serum into Mia Winters. This act initiated the immediate and total neutralization of the psychotropic filaments within her nervous system, restoring her human willpower. The serum functioned as a biological shield that protected her from Eveline's direct telepathic frequency. Mia was a hero who had been reclaimed from the fungal void by the systems engineer. The boathouse was a stage for the final restoration of the Winters marriage. The cure was a documented success. Injecting Mia meant leaving Zoe Baker behind in the Louisiana swamp without an industrial countermeasure. This decision resulted in the daughter temporarily succumbing to a state of crystalline calcification. Zoe watched as the only exit path departed without her, her mind piecing together the final betrayal of the survivors. She was a fugitive who had been reduced to a biological statistic by the very man she sought to save. The boathouse was a funeral pyre for the survival pact. The daughter was a ghost in the water. The biological reality of the serum decision confirmed that the prehistoric fire required an absolute sacrifice to be contained. Ethan utilized the only available tool to save the person he knew, ignoring the tactical logic of the alliance. This human variable was a documented failure for the industrial audit conducted by the connections. The choice initiated a secondary narrative path for the BSAA recovery teams. Every dose of the serum was a recorded cost in the struggle for survival. The boathouse was silent. The psychological impact of the choice was absolute for the systems engineer. He had to live with the knowledge that he had abandoned the woman who provided the keys to his survival. The decision was a heavy weight on his professional soul, turning the hero into a solitary actor in the dark. Ethan moved toward the tanker with a directed resolve, his focus on the final extraction of Mia. The boathouse was a memory of stone and iron, its history written in the blood of the family. The narrative baseline for the final chapters of the Dulvey Incident was established by this terminal act. Zoe's calcification ensured that she remained a localized variable for the End of Zoe campaign. The organization monitored the choice from their secret terminals, recording the data on the host's emotional priorities. Every minute Ethan spent with Mia on the tanker was a recorded risk to the national security. The serum was the final word on the boathouse investigation. The night was long. Part 32. Eveline's final form, the attic mutation. Ethan Winters returned to the main house attic to initiate the final confrontation with the old woman in the wheelchair. He utilized a specialized corporate tool to slam an experimental necrotoxin cartridge directly into her neck. This toxin was an industrial countermeasure designed to cause a total cellular rupture of the E-series asset. The injection initiated a catastrophic breakdown of Eveline's failing geriatric biology. The attic was a laboratory for the final judgment of the fungal god. The end was in the toxin. The physical body of the asset reacted violently to the chemical breach, her entire biological mass expanding exponentially within the narrow room. Her anatomy ruptured and fused directly with the timber walls and the roofing of the mansion. She created a 3-story, screaming face of black mold and pulsing tentacles that dominated the estate perimeter. This transformation was a documented peak of the E-series parasitic aggression. Eveline was a machine of viral rage that sought to consume the intruder. The house was a monster. Chris Redfield arrived via a blue umbrella chopper at exactly the zenith of the battle. He monitored the mutation from the sky, recording the data on the asset's physical output. The BSAA operative threw Ethan a high-powered anti-bow handgun, designated as the Albert 01. This weapon utilized specialized kinetic rounds designed to neutralize the regenerative capacity of the fungal superorganism. The intervention was a clinical necessity to stop the prehistoric fire from reaching the terminal stage. Ethan utilized the specialized handgun to deliver a series of terminal strikes directly to the central brain of the mutation. The Albert 01 bypassed the fungal defenses and initiated a total cellular collapse of the asset's nervous system. Eveline ceased her telepathic screaming as her entire mass began to calcify into solid stone. The fungal god was reduced to a biological statistic on the ruins of the attic. The fire was out in the house. The master was dead. The biological reality of the final form confirmed that the E-series project was a terminal liability for the industrial audit. The asset had become a being of pure structural chaos that ignored the laws of the species. The organization monitored the calcification from their secret terminals, recording the data for the next generation of Reapers. Every second of the battle was a recorded proof of the massive investment in the project. The mansion was a funeral pyre for the corporate dream. The psychological impact of the victory was absolute for the systems engineer. He had successfully outplayed the most dangerous biological weapon in the Connections catalog. Ethan moved toward the extraction helipad with a heavier heart and a clearer understanding of the Reaper's reach. The termination of Eveline was a clinical signal that the time for the architects was over. The house was a memory of stone and marble, its history buried under a mountain of viral rot. The night was over. Section 7. The Truth and the Aftermath. Part 33. What actually happened to Ethan? The sentient colony. As the military choppers landed on the plantation grounds, the horrific truth of Ethan Winters' existence was solidified by the corporate records. The necrotoxin data and his shared psychic vision with Jack Baker confirmed that the engineer was no longer human. He was a sentient colony of mold that had perfectly copied the memories, personality, and physical form of the man who deceased in the hallway. Ethan was a biological illusion held together solely by his own human willpower. The system's engineer was a ghost. The biological reality of the resurrection included an absolute regenerative capacity that allowed the host to survive fatal trauma. Ethan could reattach his own limbs and shrug off impalement because his anatomy was composed of an adaptive fungal lattice. The mold functioned as a secondary nervous system that copied the functions of the human organs with a clinical efficiency. This process was a documented success for the E-series project. The host was a being of pure viral resilience. Ethan's consciousness was a recorded template that the prehistoric fire utilized to manage the body. He possessed the same desire to save his wife and protect the innocent as the original man. This unique synergy between the host and the parasite allowed him to remain independent of Eveline's telepathic frequency. The engineer was an auditor of the apocalypse who was unaware of his own physical end. The house was a laboratory for his new life. The fire was in his blood. The organization monitored the engineer's progress with a clinical interest, recording the data on the host's stability. They realized that Ethan Winters was a miracle of biological engineering that surpassed the limits of the T-virus. He was the master of the ending, a reaper who wore the face of an ordinary man. The realization that his entire domestic life was a biological lie was a heavy weight on his professional soul. The hero was a monster. The psychological impact of the truth was absolute for the new entity. He had to navigate the final hour of the mission with the knowledge that he was a product of the laboratory. Ethan moved toward the extraction point with a directed resolve, his focus on the security of the future. He realized that the prehistoric fire had achieved a total integration with his own soul. The engineer was a witness to the end of the human era. The night was breaking. Ultimately, the revelation of Ethan's identity was the most significant lore beat of the Resident Evil timeline. It proved that the prehistoric fire could rewrite the human element without destroying the human heart. Ethan Winters was the final word on the E-series project, a being that refused to be managed by logic. The house was an archive of failure, its history written in the blood of the man who died in the driveway. The night was over. Part 34, the BSAA cover-up, the industrial hygiene. Following the successful extraction of the survivors, the BSAA and the United Nations collaborated with Blue Umbrella to initiate a massive domestic cover-up. This was a documented act of professional hygiene intended to sanitize the record of the corporate sin. The local sheriff's department reports were officially expunged and replaced with a high-level federal narrative. The authorities sought to prevent a planetary panic over the existence of an airborne mind control fungus. The silence was total. The public was told that the destruction of the Baker estate was the result of a severe and localized industrial gas leakage. This cover story provided a clinical explanation for the quarantine and the military presence within the Dulvey bayous. The BSAA utilized its authority to suppress the testimonies of the local residents and the independent media. Raccoon City was a memory, and the government sought to ensure that Dulvey did not become a second funeral pyre. The silence was a shield for the guilty. The entire Dulvey plantation was placed under a permanent military quarantine zone to facilitate the final cleanup. Blue Umbrella teams moved through the ruins of the mansion and the salt mines, recording the data on the fungal saturation. They utilized specialized chemical agents to neutralize the remaining molded swarms and the organic insect colonies. Every stone of the estate was a recorded proof of the massive investment in the biological arms race. The house was an archive of failure. The organization monitored the cover-up from their secret terminals, recording the data on the successful neutralization of the truth. They realized that the E-Series project was a terminal liability that needed to be erased from the history. The BSAA functioned as a mechanical reaper that processed the memories of the survivors. The Dulvey Incident was officially classified as a localized accident, its history buried under a mountain of federal records. The night was long. The psychological impact of the silence was absolute for the survivors. They felt the weight of the city's death in every second of the federal debrief. Raccoon City was a memory of stone and ash that was being vaporized by the law. The heroes were the only individuals who knew the truth of the industrial sin. The cover-up was a clinical success for the federal audit. The night was over and the morning was fire. The end was total. Ultimately, the cover-up was the definitive law beat for the end of the Baker narrative. It proved that the corporate and political reapers were the masters of the final outcome. The house was a graveyard of high character and failed hopes, its history written in the blood of the men who held the line. The survivors were the prophets of a new era of global bioterrorism. The night was over and the end was total. The silence was ready. Part 35. End of Zoe, the Swamp Uncle. As detailed in the End of Zoe tactical campaign, the daughter survived her calcification by entering a state of crystalline stasis within the Louisiana swamp. She was eventually discovered by her estranged uncle, Joe Baker, a rugged survivalist who lived off the grid within the bayous. Joe refused to allow the Blue Umbrella soldiers to touch his niece, initiated a high-stakes struggle for her medical security. The uncle was a professional reaper who utilized his bare hands to challenge the military logic. Armed with a high-tech robotic exoskeleton prototype scavenged from a local military camp, Joe Baker fought through the necrotic swarms of the swamp. He encountered a resurrected and heavily mutated iteration of his brother, Jack, who had survived the boathouse calcification through absolute parasitic resilience. The final confrontation between the two brothers was a visceral demonstration of the human element's struggle against the fungal rot. Joe was forced to liquidate the patriarch to secure the cure. Joe Baker utilized the specialized serum synthesized by Blue Umbrella to restore Zoe's human identity. This act was a documented miracle of the human spirit over the engineered god. The uncle had successfully outplayed the corporate reapers and the mutated god to save the last member of his family. Zoe woke up to a world of fire and ash, her mind already on the final extraction. The swamp was a sanctuary that had been held by the survivalist. The miracle was total. The biological reality of the Jack mutation confirmed that the E-Series strain could achieve a terminal state of environmental adaptation. The patriarch had become a mountain of fungal mass that ignored the laws of nature. However, the robotic technology and the human willpower of Joe Baker proved to be the superior tactical variables. The organization monitored the termination from their secret terminals, recording the data on the successful cleanup. The swamp was a funeral pyre for the patriarch. The psychological impact of the victory was absolute for the remaining Baker. She saw in Joe the terminal failure of the corporate ambition. The uncle had built a world of stone and iron to protect the innocent. Zoe moved toward the extraction helipad, with a heavier heart and a clearer understanding of the Reaper's reach. Every second she spent in the bayou was a recorded cost in the struggle for survival. The swamp was a memory of blood and iron. The night was over. Ultimately, the story of Zoe Baker was the definitive law beat for the end of the Dulvey Incident. It proved that the prehistoric fire required an absolute clarity to be contained. Joe Baker was the hero who had secured the future of the Alliance. The swamp was a memory of stone and marble, its history buried under a mountain of viral rot. The night was over, and the morning was fire. The end was total. The daughter was saved. Part 36. What Ethan and Mia did next. The European safe house. Recognizing that Ethan, Mia, and their upcoming unborn child carried highly volatile and mutated E-series genetic markers, Chris Redfield initiated an absolute witness protection protocol. The Winters family was stripped of their old American identities and forcibly relocated to a remote safe house in Eastern Europe. This facility was a high-security environment monitored by a specialized BSAA tactical squad. The organization sought to maintain the stability of the host while recording the data on the next generation. Ethan and Mia attempted to forge a quiet and normal life within the snowy mountains, unaware that they were being monitored by the global giants. The domestic peace was a fragile illusion built on a foundation of industrial sin. They lived in a world of digital shadows, their every movement recorded by the internal sensors. The Winters legacy was a marketable currency that challenged the logic of the corporate reapers. The safe house was a laboratory for their survival. The fire was in the heart. The culmination of the domestic period was the birth of their daughter, Rosemary. The child possessed a high state of E-series integration that surpassed the power of the original asset. Rose was a biological god who carried the memory of the Megamycete in her own blood. The organization viewed the girl as the ultimate prize for the biological arms race. The family was a sanctuary of high character that was being watched by the god. The morning was breaking into the final act. The psychological impact of the relocation was absolute for the systems engineer. He had to navigate the conflicting emotions of his new identity while protecting his family from the shadows. Ethan moved through the safe house with a directed resolve, his mind already piecing together the clues of the next conspiracy. He realized that the domestic peace was a documented lie. The house was a memory of stone and iron, its history buried under a mountain of viral rot. The end was total. The domestic peace was shattered completely a few years later when Chris Redfield kicked the front door open with a tactical squad. This event initiated the terminal chapter of the Winters legacy within the Resident Evil Village narrative. The operative was a Reaper who had arrived to finalize the liquidation of the E-series project. Ethan was a hero who had found his soul in the dark of the laboratory. The safe house was a funeral pyre for the corporate dream. The night was long. Ultimately, the transition to Eastern Europe was the definitive law beat for the future of the franchise. It proved that the prehistoric fire was a permanent reality that ignored the borders of the species. Ethan and Mia were the prophets of the apocalypse that was reaching its terminal peak. They moved toward the final horizon with a directed resolve, their eyes fixed on the sunrise. The night was over, and the end was just the beginning. Section 4. Lucas Baker. Part 21. Lucas's Barn. The Industrial Testing Ground. Lucas Baker initiated the second phase of the estate's biological war by converting the testing barn into a fortified industrial slaughterhouse. He utilized the captured Mia and Zoe as tactical leverage to force the systems engineer into a series of terminal engagements. The barn was rigged with high-grade pipe bombs and automated turrets, functioning as a factory for the necrotic shift. Lucas monitored the struggle via a centralized CCTV network, recording the data on Ethan's combat performance against the specialized molded. The sociopath viewed the apocalypse as a private game show where the subjects were reduced to biological statistics. The environment of the barn was characterized by an absolute state of mechanical decay and viral rot. Lucas utilized the corporate funds to install complex tripwires and pressure plates designed to liquidate any intruder. He mocked the engineer over the industrial intercom, his voice a recorded echo of his innate sadistic tendencies. The barn was a laboratory where the human spirit was tested by the prehistoric fire. Ethan was forced to navigate the architectural traps while avoiding the direct gaze of the automated sensors. The building was a cage of bone and iron. The presence of the white molded within the barn confirmed that Lucas was conducting his own private biological research. These variants featured a high regenerative capacity and absolute resistance to standard ballistic trauma. They were a documented success for the industrial audit conducted by the Connections. The sociopath utilized these monsters to measure the lethality of the E-series strain in a confined space. Ethan utilized his tactical training to neutralize the swarms, his mind already piecing together the map of the Lucas conspiracy. The fire was in the barn. Lucas treated the entire encounter as a televised trial for his corporate masters. He provided the Connections with a real-world record of the engineer's survival, turning the human tragedy into an industrial commodity. Every room in the barn was a documented trap designed to satisfy Lucas's primitive need for violence. The sociopath was a reaper who worked from the center of the estate, his mind free from the fungal control. The barn was a museum of industrial sin, where the natural order was replaced by corporate logic. The psychological impact of the barn investigation was absolute for the systems engineer. He realized that Lucas was the most dangerous variable in the Dulvey Incident because he possessed an absolute clarity. Unlike his parents, the son was an intentional actor who enjoyed the mental trauma of his family. The barn was a funeral pyre for the Baker legacy, its history written in the blood of the previous guests. Ethan moved through the final corridor with a directed resolve, his focus on the extraction of the survivors. The technical layout of the barn included a series of localized containment zones for the experimental subjects. Lucas utilized these zones to isolate the engineer and initiate a total cellular collapse of the human spirit. The battle reached its clinical peak when Ethan utilized the industrial tools to bypass the final security gate. The sociopath fled into the subterranean salt mines, leaving the barn to be consumed by the fungal fire. The building was a memory of stone and iron, its history buried under a mountain of viral rot. Part 22. The Happy Birthday Trap. The Zero-Win Scenario. Lucas Baker forced the systems engineer into an old converted mill room containing an elaborate jigsaw-style puzzle designated as Happy Birthday. This exact trap had been utilized weeks prior to execute Clancy Jarvis, the primary cameraman from the Sewer Gators internet show. The puzzle was intentionally engineered to be a zero-win scenario where the host's attempt to succeed would trigger a terminal event. The mill was a laboratory for the final judgment of the human intellect. Lucas monitored the room with a detached joy, his mind already calculating the logistics of the incineration. The environment of the mill was characterized by a heavy atmosphere of gasoline and industrial rot. The trap required the captive to light a birthday candle and place it on a cake. An act that would inevitably ignite a hidden volatile gas line. The resulting explosion was designed to cook the host alive within the reinforced walls of the chamber. This process was a documented achievement for Lucas's mechanical intellect. The Happy Birthday Room was a museum of industrial sin, where the human spirit was discarded. The candle was the scythe. Ethan Winters possessed a unique tactical advantage during the engagement due to a recovered VHS tape. He had watched the recorded footage of Clancy's death, piecing together the map of the trigger mechanisms and the digital locks. This meta-knowledge allowed the engineer to bypass the final explosion by ensuring